Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 46, Charting the Uncharted, Redrawing the Map, on daring to deviate, on defying dogma to deftly innovate. In episodes 43 to 45, we saw some of the foundational developments that characterize the Renaissance, or what we specifically understand to be the Italian Renaissance. Now, let's cast the net wider and to see similar revolutionary developments emerge elsewhere. In the last of that trilogy, episode 45, we saw that our fictional friends were out on holiday. Actually, they got up to some interesting shenanigans. So let's find out what they were up to. Steve, Brian, Brenda, Irene, Bruno the dog, and Iris the cat, now on holiday, away from home, have hired their own large boat for a week to spend time sailing across a large lake, a lake so vast and not fully explored. Their week-long adventure is to be limited to a small section close to the coast, which is to the east of the lake. With wind in the sails, Steve has a brilliant idea. Guys, you know that place called the Devil's Cove, about 2 days south from here? Let's go cross that. I mean, everyone says it's too dangerous, right? Brian adds with excitement. Yeah, man, let's do it. We shall be daring pioneer explorers. What could go wrong? Irene and Brenda object. Guys, it's called the Devil's Cove for a reason. They say folk who tried to go past it haven't been heard of since. Steve and Brian are only even more energized by the thrill of it all. So despite vociferous protestations, they end up sailing up to and past the Devil's Cove. But this is when reality strikes. While it was smooth sailing on the way south towards the cove, it now seems impossible to turn back. They will now be sailing against the wind, and the waters around here are rather shallow, which means they risk running aground and being stranded. Tidbit, the word strand, in fact, means shore, and stranded literally means run ashore. They make cautious attempts to retrace the route, but it's obvious it's far too dangerous, and Bruno's worried-sounding, incessant barking seems to confirm the worst. So now if they are stuck here, they are stuck here. Nobody around for miles, no way to get back out, and their food supplies are only for a week. So they're pacing up and down their boat. When they insisted on a big square-bottomed boat, they didn't realize it would end up being a disadvantage, but at least it's spacious enough to be pace-friendly. Compensation? And then Brenda is like, look what Iris did there. Instead of charging at that mouse directly in a straight line, it went around. Why did she do that? Steve and Brian are not amused, albeit still reluctant to admit they were foolhardy. After a while, it happens again. Irene is like, yes, Brenda, there's something here. They inspect the wooden floor, and the roundabout route Iris took seems to have advantages. It's not Greeky, and it puts the cat out of sight of the mouse until it's too late. Brenda and Irene look at each other. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Guys, this is it. Instead of tracing the same route back, we should go further west and then head back north before we get back in. Brian erupts. Come on, that's bonkers. We'll be away from the coast then. Irene adds, well, the southerly wind appears to be largely coast-hugging. If we venture away from the coast, at least we have a chance to find a friendlier route back. On the edge. Okay, now to serious stuff. This story has an important lesson. Don't hug the coast. Well, okay, that still sounds trivial. Let me explain. But first, some background. It's early 1400s Portugal. Just as it still is, Portugal was a small country, a small kingdom, almost as if itself cast away from Europe. Almost literally, like a diminutive school kid pushed to a corner in the playground. Next to it were two powerful kingdoms, Castile to the immediate north and east, and further east, the east coast kingdom of Aragon. In the far south was the Islamic kingdom of Granada, the last of the holdouts of the 800-year Muslim Spain, which in Arabic was called Al-Andalus, and today is the region known as Andalusia. The Portuguese kingdom lived in a state of constant threat. The two neighboring Spanish kingdoms seemed rather aggressive. Remember, the Reconquista was still on and will culminate only in 1492, after the union of two kingdoms of Spain and the final expulsion of the Moors from Granada. Portugal faced the threat of also being swallowed up by this resurgent Spain. So, introducing Prince Henry, or Henry the Navigator. He was not so much a navigator, but a facilitator of navigators. Gaia Straits. Prince Henry was born to King John I of Portugal and his wife Philippa, sister of King Henry IV of England. Philippa and the English king were children of the Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt. And trust me, it's entirely coincidental that I introduced John of Gaunt just in the previous episode, episode 35D, when I reworded his famous speech. Prince Henry was a very shrewd operator. He was well-versed in many areas, including statecraft, convincing the royal court to give him free rein on vast parts of foreign policy. The initial aims of this foreign policy, as spearheaded by Prince Henry, was to try and take Granada themselves before the Spanish got there. This would give them a foothold in the Mediterranean, along with hedging the risk of Spanish capture of Portugal proper. To this end, Henry at 21 was a key participant in an almost impossible capture of Ceuta, a massively fortified North African coastal city with immense strategic advantage. However, despite this being their launchpad for their intended conquest of Granada just across the strait, that venture failed spectacularly, dashing hopes of Portuguese penetration into the Mediterranean. And this was pivotal. This is in essence what motivated Henry to turn all his energies to the Atlantic. The middling sorts. These vicissitudes set into motion a series of developments that would change the world forever. And even though he didn't live to see the two major breakthroughs, it was Prince Henry who was more than anyone instrumental in all this. We have all heard of the sailing prowess of the ancient Greeks and then the Romans, and the Phoenicians who started even before. But as it's not hard to imagine, all sailing done by these ancient peoples were, well, coast-hugging. Now, where have we heard of that idea before? Even the Vikings, who came a few centuries after the days of Roman glory, largely adopted similar tactics, despite some differences in their approach compared to the Mediterraneans. So, when the Portuguese ventured further south along the Atlantic, their initial approach was also the same, coast-hugging. Clearing the coast. Prince Henry initiated, sponsored, and monitored a series of sustained technological improvements in the field of navigation. There's a fair amount of technical detail, which I'll leave in the footnotes as usual, but here are the key innovations in quick summary. The first major breakthrough can be seen as the enhancement of a centuries-old coastal fishing vessel into the Caravel, a sophisticated oceanic scout with a superior hull construction more suitable for wider exploration. An important feature of this was it had a relatively shallow draft, allowing for navigating shallow waters and getting into river mouths. Another major improvement was the triangular lateen sail, as opposed to square ones before, allowing for far greater maneuverability. And there, of course, there were developments in instrumentation, notably the innovation of taking the existing astronomical astrolabe and stripping it down to the mariner's astrolabe. Much less versatile, but far more suited to the one task at hand, navigation. Amongst the institutional innovations were Henry setting up a system of detailed documentation based on mandatory logs maintained in each voyage. These were Crown property, not the captain's. And perhaps most crucially, Henry ensuring a secure stream of funding with long-term return on investment that allowed him to commission dozens of failed ventures before seeing that return. But there was another return that was also key, perhaps the biggest. The turning point. Remember Devil's Cove? Well, that's actually based on a real-life obstacle. If you picture the westward protrusion of the northern part of Africa, somewhat before you get to maximum protrusion, sort of vertically midway across the Sahara, around the Tropic of Cancer, is a place called Cape Bojador. This was the impassable impossible that European navigators had to contend with. Every attempt to get there and return safely had failed. This was compounded by medieval myths, which portended that the earth was so hot beyond there that your blood would boil. It was called the Green Sea of Darkness, and its Arabic name was Abu Qatar, Father Danger. Under Henry's patronage, navigator Gil Ains finally managed to get there and, as we saw in our fictional story, gave up on the coast hugging, sailed west wide into the open sea, losing sight of land, but holding on steadfast until finding a favorable wind to sail back up north, back home. This, the Volta do Mar, or return from sea, was that big return. High seas, higher hopes. The Volta was what turned everything. If you may excuse my multilingual pun. Cape Bojador was a severe psychological barrier that had to be crossed, and once they crossed that, well, the sky was the limit. Well, actually, the southern tip of Africa is perhaps more appropriate. So the two big milestones were Bartolomeo Diaz crossing that tip, subsequently named the Cape of Good Hope, to enter the Indian Ocean in 1488, and Vasco da Gama reaching India in 1498. However, Prince Henry was not alive to witness and celebrate these two events. He died in 1460. This, of course, marks the beginning of the Age of Exploration, as soon other Atlantic nations would follow the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, and excluding the minor ones. Pardonnez-moi, Bonaparte. Ultimately, the British, and as we know, for good or bad, this changed the world map forever. De gustibus restaurandum. In order to understand this more profoundly, there's a bit more context that needs to be considered. Yes, the Portuguese were motivated to venture out into the wide open sea for reasons I mentioned above, but there were more fundamental causes for European Atlantic exploration. Ancient Rome had intensive trade with the Indian subcontinent. In fact, the largest collection of Roman coins outside Europe unearthed has been in India. And in their glory days, the Romans ate rather spicy food. Cumin, pepper, all the good stuff. No, this is true. Not just my spicy take. With the advent of Islam, it was the Arabs who took control of the routes between the continents of Europe and India as middlemen. It was the Middle East, after all. Extracting huge margins from Europeans hungry for spice. In fact, it wasn't just spice trade. The Arabs, in cooperation with local African elites, were the most prolific slave traders, an altogether less wholesome trade the Europeans would inherit from them. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, as we saw in episode 39 and episode 40, as marking the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern, can also be seen as iconic in ushering in the age of exploration, thanks to their heavy-handed hindrance to Europe's trade with the Orient. So, of course, the rise of European power in these regions meant the end of the centuries-long dominance of the Arabs in the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean, since the Europeans circumnavigated to circumvent the Middle Eastern middleman problem. But looking wider, there were other, far more powerful earlier maritime innovations with real or potential groundbreaking consequences, which it can be said would dwarf the European achievements of this period. While I expect to come back to a couple of the most astonishing examples of this, let's quickly mention the Chinese one. Between 1405 and 1433, a Ming Dynasty admiral named Zheng He commanded 7 treasure voyages across Asia, from China going as far as up the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. And these fleets represented scale and technology far superior to what the Europeans will take at least another century to come close to replicating. But almost as if in a fit of an impulse of a whim, the Ming leadership completely ended the voyages in 1433 and ordered all ships burned and knowledge destroyed. Whoever saw that coming? The course of innovation can be quite unpredictable. We have seen in episode 20 how the key strengths of some of the greatest empires became their greatest weakness, leading to their catastrophic downfall. We've seen elsewhere in this series how weaknesses or disadvantages often led to people and societies developing new innovations that ended up giving them sources of great power. Lying in his deathbed, what would Prince Henry have pondered? Where would he have imagined that tiny strip of land that he called home would be in 100 years? And with the benefit of hindsight, how much of all that followed can we attribute to the strategic vision of this hardly ever himself navigated far beyond home shores Henry the Navigator? In the study of innovation, as much as history in general, there is this debate as to who is more instrumental: certain individuals, the so-called great man theory, or wider institutional forces. Perhaps, and given reality is never really that clear-cut, it's rather a combination of both.